Greetings, my fellow Americans. Welcome to another episode of the Great Montana Conspiracy. As you can tell, we are once again filming from a remote location. Quite frankly, my day just got away from me, and I'd either sit down and do it now, or I'm just not going to get it done. Tonight's episode is going to be on objectification. Now, objectification is very simply put, it is taking someone's name and replacing it with a term or a label. For instance, you might say, I know the old ladies at home. The old lady, of course, is an objectification. It's a way of dehumanizing by making someone an object rather than a person. By saying the old lady's at home, you're now saying that the actual problem is that the wife, who may be Linda, maybe Frances, maybe whatever, no longer has a name. She's a woman. She's just the woman. She's an object. It's easier to dismiss emotions and guilt when you dehumanize people through objectification. It makes it easier to hurt them. It makes it easier to demean them, to dehumanize them, to make them to where they don't matter. And it's so much easier to do when they're not really people you're dealing with. They're terms. You've heard terms like the perp, or the prisoner, or the cop, or the fuzz, or whatever. Anytime you have an application of a term to represent an individual, instead of Mr. Glick, Mr. Russell, Mr. Francis, whatever, or just first names, Ron, Frank, Thomas, you're dehumanizing people through terms and labels, especially when it's used for that express purpose. Now, tonight I'm actually going to take an excerpt from my own book. And a little bit of self-promotion here. This is a book I wrote a few years ago. It's called I Do, the Independent Domestic Objective. And it specifically deals with abuse control relationships. But objectification is a very big part of the demeaning aspect of abuse control. But it's also used very widely and broadly across society. And in this case, for the purposes of the Great Montana Conspiracy, it's used in government. And it's used by government to treat citizens in a far less than human capacity. And I'm actually going to read an excerpt from this because I go through a great deal of explaining within the book. But obviously, it's going to be far more comprehensive when you read the book. But for the purposes that we're going to do right now, I'm going to read a small excerpt so I can actually get you an idea rather than try to sit here and try to rehash it. Another very common technique used for diminishment is objectification. Simply put, to objectify someone is to degrade them by making them an object rather than a person. Abusers will use this as a subtle way to make their victim assume a lesser status in their relationship, but also to minimize their victim's sense of being a person in the first place. This quote, and as I said, it talks about it quite a bit more inside the book, and of course, all aspects of abuse control, is that you're taking a person and you are making them a possession. You're making them something that you don't have to give emotional objectivity to. You don't have to give any kind of realistic anything. You don't have to be guilty. You don't have to be sorry. You don't have to worry about leaving them at home with the kids. You don't have to worry about any of the guilt or negative emotions that would normally be attached to dealing with a regular human being. When you're talking to someone on the phone and you call them names, you call them, you witch, insert the appropriate letter at the beginning of that, you're dehumanizing them. You're objectifying them. In court, you will see objectification like 90% of all legal documents. You'll see defendant did this or plaintiff did that. Even referring to someone by only a last name is objectifying. Glick did this. Williams did this. Dehumanizing through lack of dignity rather than not Mr. or Miss, or even just not using a name at all. The defendant, the plaintiff, the respondent. These are all ways of dehumanizing and taking people away from being human and making them objects to be studied in a non-human capacity. In the case of law, it could be argued it actually serves a purpose, since in law you're supposed to have an impartial judiciary. It doesn't work that way in real-world application, but that is an argument that I've often heard. The reason why we use objectification with law is because of that reason. The idea is that law is supposed to be impartial. It's supposed to remove itself from the situation and circumstance, and therefore, by removing itself, it becomes impartial. That only works if it's equal. If it's not equal, if you have one side just tearing someone down for being the defendant or using that aspect to undermine them, then you're not dealing with an actual situation of equality or impartiality. You're dealing with dehumanization. And that's what our government does far too much. Now, of course, criminals do the same thing. Criminals see targets of their crimes as scores or marks. The same effect. No concern for emotional consequence. No concern if the victim is hurt, if the victim loses anything, if there's any consequences. The victim is an object. The victim is a target, a score, something to go after. Not something to worry about. Am I taking their rent? Are they going to get kicked out on the street? Are they going to be able to feed their kids tonight? The criminal doesn't have to think about that when they're attacking victims, because the victim becomes less than human. They don't represent anything. Some of the most violent offenders and sexual offenders out there will do the same thing. They will see their victim as an object, something to have sex with, something to hit, something to take out their frustrations on, something to do anything to that is not required to think about them as a person. There's been many therapies across the country where people actually try to get criminals to sit down with their victims so the criminals can feel the consequences of their actions, to let them see the dangers of objectifying their victims, and possibly get some empathic or emotional healing between the two. Pornography is often depicted as an example as objectifying women. In that instance, though, in the instance of porn, honestly, in most cases, not always, but in most cases, it's a willful choice of the participants in the pornography movies. The people who make the application of the term that it's victimizing women or it's victimizing men or it's victimizing whatever, that it's somehow objectifying them, they're the people who have more of a reason to oppose it. They're the people who don't want, for whether it be moral reasons, legal reasons, whatever, they have a problem with pornography, and therefore they use this as a term to go out there and attack pornography. But the participants in pornography, the ones who are actually choosing to do this, they're choosing to be objects of sex. They're choosing to gain popularity, they're choosing the money, they're choosing whatever benefit they go into. They're making that choice. If I'm in a relationship and I have a girlfriend, and the girlfriend says, I want you to call me dirty. Just wherever we go, just call me dirty. It'll turn me on. Then you're not dealing with objectification if you say, hey, dirty, or dirty's over there. Because that's a pet name. That's a choice. You're assuming that. You're not objectifying because you're not diminishing the person. The person has asked for it. The person has requested it. Bambi, cutie pie, love bug. Terms of endearment that are willfully accepted and chosen are not issues of objectification. Objectification is when it is thrust upon somebody against their will, against their circumstances, and in the process of it being thrust upon them, it diminishes them, and it demeans them, and it demoralizes them, and it makes them subhuman. If anything, it makes them animals in the perception of the person who's actually doing the objectification. Going back to the book I'm citing, again, The Independent Domestic Objective. This is actually much more common than you might think. We deal with being objectified every day in society, whether it's being called the boss, a peon, a babe, a dog, etc. In each instance, these words are used to substitute for a person's true self. As an example, calling someone the boss makes them an object, not a person. It makes that person easier to relate to in a less personal way. You can feel resentment, scorn, even hatred for them without any genuine guilt, because as an object, you do not have to take the time to consider their feelings. Simply put, as an object, they have no feelings to consider. This is incredibly common in relationships. Even people not deliberately intending to be abusive will find themselves objectifying their mate. My woman or the old ball and chain are both very common examples of objectification one might direct toward their beau. It makes it easier to minimize their feelings as individuals by making them objects in their mind. Likewise, it becomes easier to identify them as property rather than people with individual needs, feelings, and points of view. Regardless of the intent, it is abuse. Regardless of whether the intent is abuse, actually identifying people in your life this way is abusive. This is not the same as having a pet name for someone or referring to someone as sir or miss. These are terms of endearment or respect and are typically directed as their recipient or at their recipient. In the case of objectification, it is usually directed at other people. For instance, it would not be objectifying your wife to say, you're my woman. But it would be if you told your friends, I need to get home to my woman. Abusers use diminishment to control how their victims feel about themselves, and objectification is a big tool for that. Abusers will use objectification freely while in the presence of their victim so they understand their place. A normal, healthy way to introduce someone you are seeing to a group of friends would be to say something like, this is Jennifer, my girlfriend. An abuser using objectification would be more prone to say, this is my woman. You'd be amazed at how often an abuser will introduce their victim precisely in this way, not offering their victim's name in such an introduction. Yet another way of identifying their victim as an object rather than a person without a name, their victim has no identity. And this is exactly what happens in a court of law. The prosecutor will get up there and say, the defendant did this. The defendant did this, not Mr. Williams did this, not Mr. Jose did this, not Jose, not Mr. Juarez, nothing. It's the defendant did this, the defendant did this, the defendant did that. Because it allows it to be dehumanized, not only for the purposes of the speaker, but for the judge. If the judge is not hearing the person's name, the judge is not identifying with the person, the judge is identifying with the actual term. It's the defendant. And there's automatically an inherent negativity attached with being a defendant. You're defending against a crime. You are the one who's being charged with a crime. Whether in the case of a civil suit, same thing. You're the one being sued. There's a negative connotation to being the recipient of the prosecution. And they know this, and which is why they use the terminology, it's why they objectify. In most cases, you will see a defendant, not refer to the prosecution or the state. They will say, Mr. Sims did this, or Miss Chavez did this. They'll refer to the prosecutors by their names. Watch any number of videos on court cases and you'll see it, where the prosecutor will refer to the defendant as the defendant, whereas the defense counsel will refer to the prosecutors as by their individual names when they're talking about the individuals they're dealing with right then and there. Now they may say things like the state wants this and the state wants that, and they're talking about the actual prosecution, the charge. But most of the time when they're talking about the actions of the individual counsel, they will use the counsel's name. It's a double standard. They do not refer to them as the prosecutor. They don't refer to them as the plaintiff in the case. They refer to them as by their names. Because defendants counsel don't refer to prosecutors. They don't objectify them. Because objectification is a demeanment, and the defense rarely demeans the prosecution. It's a consequence. It's what happens in a court of law, and it's what happens in Montana. It happens everywhere. In government, objectification is used for more than prosecution, though. It's used to provoke fear of crime. By objectifying criminals, it makes victims more fearful of a faceless offense. There may be no real threat, but by objectifying the threat, by objectifying the crime, it makes that credible when it's not. Terrorism is a perfect example of this. The Patriot Act was pushed through largely on the fear provoked through objectification. Can't let the terrorists get us. Can't have another 9/11. Can't have another circumstance where they're going to be on our soil. We have to defend ourselves. And they used that banner. They used that objectification. They didn't say, this is an example of Mr. Osama bin Laden. This is a representation of the threat he represents. This is his organization. It wasn't the names of the individuals who flew into the trade tower. It wasn't the individuals who flew into the Pentagon. It wasn't the hijackers who were discovered who didn't get on planes. No, it was always the terrorists, the terrorists, the terrorists. Objectification. And that was used as a fear to promote the passage of a very wide-sweeping, invasive law in America called the Patriot Act. It was in response to 9/11, which 9/11/2001, where America was attacked by terrorists who hijacked planes and flew into various buildings, and caused wholesale terror in American soil. And anybody who's probably around the world is aware of it. We've lived it because it's our country. To anybody who's not from America would not recognize this necessarily, but 9/11 is a big deal. The biggest problem that happens, though, is when you start using objectification, and it's used as a fear-mongering tactic rather than a tactic of actual clarification, like he is a terrorist because he has done this. He committed terrorist acts because he did that. Terrorist. You're not using it to define, you're using it to label. You're using it to objectify. In 2015, Laurel Watson from the University of Missouri, Kansas City, wrote a report that cited objectification being responsible for women's heightened fear, particularly heightened fear of sexual assault. Even though women are far less likely to be victims of crime, it's statistically true. It's like a 5-to-1 ratio. Men are victimized by crimes more than women, whether it be because our culture, whether it just be men are seen as wealthier targets, whatever. Women are considerably less targeted by actual crime. And yet their fear of being assaulted, their fear that if they are a victim of a crime, they're going to be sexually assaulted, is a predominant belief that has been led on by objectification. Women have substantially more fear of face-to-face crime than men do. It's not because women are more fearful or women are a weaker sex. It's because they've been indoctrinated through objectification to fear physical assault. A quote from the report says, "Our research supports previous findings that the rampant sexual objectification of women and active sexual terrorism can heighten women's fear of incurring physical and sexual harm." In other words, objectifying the fear of rape has made women more fearful of crime. By objectifying it and taking a woman's body, her vagina, her breasts, her sexual capacity as an object of a horrible person who wants to have sex with her body and not her as a person, the objectification of the society has dehumanized it in such a way that they're not fearful of an individual. They're fearful of an act that has no face. It becomes faceless. Even when statistics plainly demonstrate they are a far less risk of harm, all forms of sexual objectification share a common thread, though. It's when it comes to the fear of rape, a woman's body or body parts are the objectified act. Are they going to rape her vagina? Are they going to grab her, behind? Are they going to grab her breasts? Are they going to accost her in some way, physically, in an unwanted way that's going to be harmful to her, both either emotionally or physically? When they're confronted with face-to-face crime, this objectivity or this objectification has led them to believe that it's automatically going to be a sexual assault. And the truth is that somebody just want to hold her up for her purse or her diamonds or for the car she's driving. It have nothing to do with the sexuality. There's some movies I've seen, a couple I can't think of. I can think of the scenes, but I can't think of what movies they're from, where a girl's being robbed, and the thief just wants her purse or wants her car or whatever, and she's like, "What? You don't want to rape me?" And he's like, "No, just want the car, just want the purse," and they get offended. What? I'm not good enough to rape? I'm not good enough to assault? What? You don't think I'm pretty? The idea is, this is that level of expectation. It's actually working to the humor of our society, to the point that we don't even recognize it as anything other than humor or a very real thing, when in fact it's not a real thing. Now, I'm not saying that rape is not a real thing, not saying that sexual assault is not a real thing, and not minimizing that in any capacity. These crimes do happen, and they are horrific when they're real. But the truth is, so many situations and circumstances start from women crying rape because they think they're going to be. Countless crimes across the country are reported in just muggings or many kinds of just various crimes where the woman automatically claims sexual assault because she thinks she was going to be, and therefore makes the claim that she was, to make sure that it doesn't happen to somebody else. It's a misconceived concept, and obviously there's no way they can know or not know. But if it doesn't happen, it doesn't happen. And they should be grateful it doesn't happen. Yet, they'd rather sit there with the belief and the fear and let that fear predominate them to the point they would actually make false reports just because they think they're doing the right thing. Well, this person would have raped me if he had a chance. Objectification breeds fear. But what it does more than anything else, objectification creates an animalistic, dehumanizing element in criminal justice. It makes what would otherwise be personal, impersonal. Police will often objectify along racial lines. We saw that this last year with the Floyd riots. We saw the reaction of the law enforcement to the various crowds that gathered. We saw all kinds of things that were dehumanizing because they did not see the rioters or Floyd or black people or people standing up as anything more than objects. They were not people. They did not care whether they hurt them. They did not care if there were consequences to whatever their actions were. And I'm not saying that some of the protesters didn't have the same dehumanizing element toward police. Police were police. They weren't Sergeant O'Hara. They weren't, Commissioner this or Officer that. They were not people. But we saw more of it reflected from the police down to the people than we did see the people up the other direction. And regardless of whether it was the opposite, the fact is, our government is supposed to be there to protect the people. It's supposed to be there to serve the people. It's not supposed to be there to objectify the people, dehumanize them, create an animalistic perception of where they are just animals and don't have any rights, feelings, or have to live up to any consideration for them. Criminals themselves will objectify along class lines for much the same reason. You see, they'll divide a murderer from someone else in their own classification. They'll see a rat, somebody who's an informant, and they will dehumanize him. That's not Frank. He's talking to the police. That's the rat. That's the narc. They don't sit here and try to say Frank is over there talking to the police. No, Frank's the rat. He's the rat. They're just going to call him the rat from there on, the narc. It's dehumanizing objectivity. But again, this is to be expected from people. It's not to be expected from government. And that's where the problem lies, and that's where the division is. Of course, in this instance, it's not unique to Montana. Montana does not have its own little corner of the world where objectification is somehow made 100 times worse by some individual act. This is one of those situations to where it's a universal application across our country. Not that Montana doesn't take advantage of it, and it does. Readily. I'm a U.S. political prisoner because of objectification, because they could label me, because they could sit here and demean me to society, attach a label to my name that has such a horrendous taboo and perception by society that it underscores any hope of support I can possibly glean. It dehumanizes me. I become a label. I become somebody that other people can make up allegations against, other people can abuse, harass, even terrorize. Because it's okay. I'm not a human being. I'm just a sex offender. In reality, I'm not. But that's how they see it. They see it as justifiable and okay because that term has been attached. That's objectification. And it's done to diminish an individual from any hope of standing up. Again, you have this unclear division, an unfair division between a prosecutor and a defendant. And when you can use objectification becomes a weapon to clearly create a bias and a tendency toward, an inclination towards a belief of wrongdoing. You can use objectification to enhance your own ability to proceed against a cause and a prosecution that you shouldn't be proceeding against just because you can. Government oversteps its bounds. Objectification may not be the underlying problem in Montana, but it is a tool to maintain control. We've talked previously about various topics. We've talked about elitism. We've talked about the presumption of guilt. All of these things are examples of how objectification are used to advance a process. Objectification is used to advance elitism by breaking things down in class, whether they're business owners, they're police, they're government, they're the mayor, they're whatever. They're just people. They're just citizens. They're just people. Not Mr. Glick, Mr. Smith. It's, he's the supposed victim. He's the alleged victim. It's all objectification, and it separates things and allows them to dehumanize it in a way that gives them ability and clout. And so long as they have the ability and clout, it makes it much easier to advance dehumanizing elements against the citizens of the country. As I said, this is not unique to Montana. This is not a situation that originated here. It's not a situation that's necessarily been blown up, as so many other circumstances have. But it's definitely a tool that Montana loves to use. They love to use it because it works. It works for the basic human element that we perceive things and we classify things easier. If it's a cat, we call it a cat. If it's a duck, we call it a duck. If it's a pervert, we call him a pervert. If he's a thief, we call him a thief, because it's easier to classify things than it is to actually sit down and actually think about what that person is or who that person is and what the consequences of those prejudgments and predispositions are. I had a counselor once who said, "You are not a sex offender because you offended someone sexually. You are a person who committed a sex offense." That definition applies all across the board. Just because someone is an addict doesn't mean they're an addict. That's a dehumanizing term. That is a objectification. As a person who has an addiction or a history of addiction, it doesn't necessarily mean that that person is and always will be, and this is what the person is defined as, because then it makes that person feel that's all they have out of life. If you have somebody who robbed a bank, it doesn't mean they're going to be robbing banks every second of every day for the rest of their life. I made the joke when I was talking about elitism, about how, okay, I guess it's okay if I rob a bank and the police catch up with me later, they can't arrest me because I'm no longer robbing the bank. But obviously I robbed the bank, I committed a crime, I'm accountable. In that scenario, this is not an admission that I robbed a bank. In that scenario, in that hypothetical scenario, I robbed the bank. Therefore, I committed a crime. Therefore, I'm accountable under law for that crime. But it doesn't make me a bank robber. It doesn't define me for the rest of my life. It doesn't make me what I did a terminology in which I can be classified. Just because I have Native American ancestry, I have Apache ancestry, it doesn't mean I'm an Indian. I'm a person. I have a name. I have history. I have emotions. I have feelings. I have a financial portfolio that sucks really bad. I'm amongst the poor of our society. That's just a simple fact. It doesn't make me a degenerate. It doesn't make me a criminal. It doesn't make me these things, because these are all terms of objectification, and they are used to demean, dehumanize, and to make an animalistic approach to other people. It's a practice we as humans do. It's a practice that we humans need to stop. And most especially, the people who are in the higher echelon of our society, they're supposed to be protecting the rest of us, should not be allowed to use this against the rest. And again, we're talking about a vast minority compared to the majority of people that it's used against. It's used to keep people down. Emperor Constantine of the Roman Empire adopted Christianity as the empire's religion, not because he believed in Christianity, because Christians, objectification, were easily pacified. Because Christians believed, if you strike me, I will simply offer you my other cheek to strike. I am a pacifist. I shall not raise a hand against you. I shall not fight back against you. I shall tolerate and endure, because that is what my Lord wants me to do. It was a great, I mean, let's control an empire with a bunch of people who are taught not to fight back, not to rebel, not to criticize the government, because that's the best way for an empire to run, is when the people don't rise up against you, especially when you're as broadly spanned out at that time as the Roman Empire was. Without any modern convention, the Roman Empire held a vast amount of territory and had to maintain control. What better way than to indoctrinate people into a faith that said, we don't have to fight, they won't fight back because they're told not to fight back. But it allowed the government of Rome to objectify the individuals and classify them in one way that made them easy to rout out and dismiss. It dehumanized them. Now, mind you, in the process, it kind of came back and bit the Romans in the butt, because they gave the Vatican territory to them. They gave all kinds of resources and everything else to help build up the church. And by the time it was all said and done, the Catholic Church was a pretty powerful beast when the Roman Empire fell. It was what held, quite frankly, Europe together. And it wouldn't have happened if it wasn't created for that one purpose, to help keep the masses under control. Objectification can lead to long-term indoctrination. And that's what we're dealing with today. That's why it's so easy to recognize a criminal, a felon, a habitual offender, whatever term you want to use. They have names, they have personalities, and we should not let the government ever take that away from us. Because when we do, we're no longer democracy, we're no longer a republic. We're just sheep following a shepherd, and he tells us where we can drink. As always, thank you for listening. If you have any questions, of course, forward them to me. Contact information should be attached to this video. If it's not, by all means, visit me on YouTube. Look up the Great Montana Conspiracy Podcast. Like and subscribe. The more likers and subscribers we have, the more influence we have. If you can't find me on there, by all means, go back to the original source of this podcast, which is monspiracy.podbean.com. Once again, if you're listening, I hope you're safe out there. And if ever possible, please be free. Thank you.